This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated online cinema streaming exceptional films from around the globe. Get your first month for free at mubi.com/royalocean.
What's secret? The location to one of the greatest sunken treasures in all history.
The wreck of the unicorn. He means to steal it. The third scroll. Billions of blue blistering barnacles, I swear! As the last of the Haddocks, I will get that boat before Sakharin does.
To Bagar!
To Bagar.
For as trite as I know it'll sound, I think it's easy to forget just how far we've come in so short an amount of time, and just how much we take for granted. That's a thought I had recently while watching the Steven Spielberg-Peter Jackson team-up The Adventures of Tintin, a movie I hadn't seen since its release in 2011, and it prompted me to go back and revisit a number of titles from the same class of movies, the motion capture cartoons. An odd little subgenre or movement, or whichever word you prefer to use, of photorealistic, computer-generated animated films from the 2000s and early 2010s whose character movements were largely based off of motion capture performances like the ones you're seeing now. Right now, we're 10 years removed from Tintin, but in 2011, we were 10 years removed from one of the first movies of its kind, the 2001 Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. And any sort of comparison between the two of them will just about make your jaw drop. Like all new technologies, motion capture cartoons were met with as much trepidation and even resistance as they were with praise. If you've seen any of these movies, I'm sure you've heard all sorts of complaints and rants about the awkward style of animation, but it's worth remembering just how much resistance there really was when they were first released. Pop quiz. Which famous actor, upon seeing Final Fantasy, told the New York Times that he was very troubled by what motion capture performances would mean for actors moving forward? Why, that would be none other than Tom Hanks, who apparently wasn't actually all that troubled or just accepted that resistance was futile when he played a gajillion roles in The Polar Express just a couple of years later. Still, the ire that these films and motion capture as a whole drew was fairly widespread at the time. Does motion capture minimize the role of the actor? Does it minimize the role of the animator? Does it even count as true animation or just some very expensive cheat code? Was Andy Serkis actually acting or just standing in? As ridiculous or overreaching as any of that may seem today, it was pretty commonplace 15 years ago. If you stay to the end of Ratatouille's credits, for instance, you'll find a little quality assurance stinger that Brad Bird had put in that assured the audience no mocap shortcuts were used in the production of the film. The feeling of the time, however, was probably best summed up by animation guru Jerry Beck, who wrote after Happy Feet took home the Best Animated Feature Oscar in 2007, "Unfortunately, the win by Happy Feet will reinforce the powers that be in Hollywood that motion capture is a valid substitute for authentic character animation, that live-action writers, directors, and actors can make a cartoon without the skills honed by decades of accomplishment created by Walt Disney and his successors." Think what you will about any of this. You can love these films, you can hate them, you can argue that they're not true animation, you can argue that they are, but it's not too difficult to see why there was such animosity at the time. I would argue at least that the decade of the 2000s featured some of the most significant and seismic changes in the way that we make and show films in the entire history of the medium. At the beginning of the decade, after all, every theater in the world was still showing film prints, but by the end, that was in the midst of completely changing. This was the decade when 35mm cameras began being swapped for digital, when Disney and DreamWorks announced that they were done with hand-drawn animation for their features, and it was the decade that climaxed with Avatar inciting a resurgence of 3D. It was a volatile time, and the emergence of all this newfangled digital technology, including the motion capture cartoon, were at best seen as the makings of a brave new world, and at the worst, something of a threat. And yet, I think Tintin stands out. Not only as an artifact of what's now something of a bygone era, but as the best of a motley crew. Since the beginning with Final Fantasy, the most glaring stumbling block so many folks have had with motion capture cartoons has been the design of the characters themselves, the rubbery plastic Barbie doll look that has a tendency to come across so unnatural and just plain eerie, a sentiment most notably embodied in the characters that occupy the cartoons Robert Zemeckis has directed. It's a weird little paradox, really. The pursuit of realistic-looking characters often just winds up generating a sense of lifelessness. It's the uncanny valley conversation that's been repeated and recycled practically every year since the heyday of these films, or at least every time Disney resurrects another dead actor. And yet, it's the other side of that paradox that's just as important. Moving away from reality is often the shortest road towards creating a sense of life and believability. It's an ages-old idea and a fundamental concept to animation itself, and this is actually where I think Tintin succeeds. Instead of the hyper-realism found in Beowulf or the Polar Express, Tintin falls somewhere in the middle. Its characters are photorealistic, but are caricatured enough that they still feel like genuine cartoons. They're a significant step away from Hergé's original designs, and certainly did piss off a lot of Tintin purists, but for what it's worth, for me, it achieves the thing that most motion capture cartoons aren't able to do. Especially now, 10 years on, it's just about the only one that I can revisit and forget about the style while watching. Whereas with the others, I just find myself easily distracted by it. That's gotta count for something. Still, I think a lot of people, and I would count myself as one of them, just simply question why this style of animation to tell these stories in the first place. I don't dislike the Zemeckis trilogy, but it wasn't until A Christmas Carol, the last of the three he directed, that I feel like he justified the mocap digital approach by going all out and imbuing the film with a kind of wild visual inventiveness. The Ghost of Christmas Present sequence is still one that I think works really well. And I think Spielberg picked up and ran with that sentiment. You can obviously see it in the giant one-shot sequence up and over and through the streets of Bagar, but also in a smaller composition like this that would be no less impossible to achieve in live action. You can see it in the head-spinning scene transitions, and in a cross-cut sequence like this.
Wait, Captain. I remember everything now. Everything Granddaddy told me.
This was Spielberg taking full advantage of a new digital toolset, not just working it for all it could accomplish, but using it to craft an almost constant rush of action. Where individual sequences in Zemeckis' films took on a roller coaster quality, Tintin just is a roller coaster. It's arguably the fastest movie Spielberg has made in his entire career, careening its way forward with hardly a moment to breathe. Revisiting it today, that winds up being both the most interesting thing about it and the most frustrating. On a purely formal level, it's pretty engrossing. Break the movie down, and it's a long series of small action beats. Some slapstick, some zany, some extravagant, but all tightly compacted together and shot through with a bolt of manic energy. If ever a movie were a universal theme park ride brought to the screen, this would be it. And yet, that's pretty much all that it is. For as thrilling a ride as it may be, what it's missing in large part are the sharper characters, and even more so, all of the little in-between moments, the careful human observations that lend a sense of dramatic weight that Spielberg is usually so good at.
It's not the years, it's the mileage.
Without them, Tintin is all high-octane action, and not too much else.
I wouldn't do that if I were you.
Consider that across its 107 minutes, there's only one real moment where Tintin himself is forced to make anything that amounts to a difficult decision.
Let the bird go now, or this man dies. No! Wait!
Which he makes with complete ease because, well, it's Tintin after all. Watching the movie again, this scene in particular struck me quite a bit though, as it's an example of what I think the movie is missing. It's a classic kind of standoff setup that Spielberg has employed multiple times that forces a character to make a difficult decision between two things that they desperately care about.
What do you value more?
But it's a decision that I think would have been far more intriguing to see Haddock be forced to make, rather than Tintin. Haddock, who's already proven himself to be untrustworthy and self-serving, being forced to choose between a treasure map leading to riches that would restore his family's name or a new friend who's helped him along the way, would have rang with much more weight than it does with Tintin. After all, the script already rests any attempt at an emotional throughline on Haddock's shoulders with his kicking the sauce and coming into his own, but it barely takes the time to explore that struggle that it would really need to sink in with any sort of impact.
That's right. Why don't you have a drink? It's all you've got left, isn't it?
Even his defining moment in the climax gets undercut in the very moment it should be at its most affecting, thus deflating any emotional resonance that a moment like this could have had.
Thundering typhoons.
None of which makes the movie as a whole any less amusing, only light to the point of practically being weightless. Think of something like Tenet and Christopher Nolan doing all of the logistics and mechanics that he's obsessed with, but stripped of nearly all the emotion that made something like Inception so well-rounded. Tintin is kind of the same thing for Spielberg. All of the swashbuckling theme park comic book action and spectacle that he loves condensed into a rapid little sugary Saturday morning cartoon. I don't think that it's a great film. It's not an underrated, forgotten masterpiece, but reservations aside, I do think that it's aged well. Likely the best motion capture cartoon we've gotten to date, and a bit of a charming oddity when looking at the whole of Spielberg's lineup, particularly the movies he's directed since the turn of the century. And it did constitute as something of an experiment, throwing away the tools he was used to and almost relearning how to make a film in what was ostensibly an entirely new environment. And for a director who can pretty much do anything that he wants to continue experimenting like this into his late career, just reaffirms why he's still one of the most interesting directors working today.
And cut.
Did you say you were related to Sir Francis Haddock?
I'll end by saying that for as well executed as I think Tintin's motion capture style was done, I can't help but wonder looking back whether or not there's another method yet to be done that would bring Hergé's stories to life even better. When I think about the animated features we've gotten in the last 10 years, I think about Van Gogh's paintings brought to life in Loving Vincent, or the feeling of stepping into the panels of a comic book that Spider-Verse boasted. I think about the handcrafted textures straight out of a concept art book in Klaus, and the woodblock painting style found in The Tale of the Princess Kaguya, and the sketchbook scribbles in last year's Wolfwalkers. And I don't know, maybe there's a similar style out there for Tintin that's yet to be made, something that would lift Hergé's signature visual style to the screen in an even truer way that's just begging to be made. Or, you know, maybe they could just stick to the original plan and let Peter Jackson direct the sequel. Either way. Hey everybody, thanks so much for watching. This was such a fun video to make, going back and revisiting Tintin and a whole bunch of the motion capture cartoons. And the whole time, I couldn't help but think about just how quickly so much of the technology used to make these movies has evolved. It boggles the mind comparing the work done on something like Final Fantasy just a few short years ago to the films that have been made in the years since. And of course, the other side of looking back is to see just how much change has occurred in the way that we consume films. Today, more than ever before, there are so many different options. Blu-rays, VOD, 1,000 different streaming services, and finding a reliable source for good movies can be a bit overwhelming. And that's why I want to tell you about the sponsor of this video, Mubi. If you don't know, Mubi is a curated streaming service that premieres a new film every day. From exciting up-and-coming filmmakers to timeless classics from master directors to cult favorites you've never seen, there's always something new to discover. It's like your own personal film festival streaming anytime, anywhere. Every film comes lovingly handpicked and curated, and because of that, I found that I wind up spending way less time browsing through endless titles and adding things to watch lists, and more time actually watching. It's a much more streamlined strategy in that sense, and it's one that I think is pretty brilliant. For me, it's resulted in the discovery of quite a few new gems, a number of which I'd never even heard of before. If you're interested in trying it out and getting an entire month of great cinema for free, you can go to Mubi.com/RoyalOcean to sign up today. Guys, thanks so much again for watching. If you liked this video and want to help support the channel, be sure to check out my Patreon page, where every dollar donated goes into making these videos as best as they can be. I'll see you in the next video.